Deputy Sam Mézec, Minister of Housing, welcome to the pod. It's really exciting to have you here as our first guest on the maiden episode of the What If show. We're here in the snazzy and opulent surroundings of the Melting Pot, who is kindly playing host to us, and we've been given some lovely mocktails as well. I believe your one's called a Designated Driver. My one's called Hero to Zero. Have you given it a go yet?
Yeah, indeed. Very nice. Cheers.
Cheers. So, Sam, you've been Housing Minister now for over 2 years, and it's really timely and topical to have you on the show now that these issues are being debated in the public forum and in government as well. So I wanted to dive in by framing and contextualising the problem of housing for the younger generation, and I wanted to acknowledge what most people on the island are feeling right now, that life just doesn't feel affordable. And that's not just about perception, it's about stats. So Jersey was recently ranked by Numbeo as the most expensive place to live in the world, cost of living 117% higher than the UK. Young people are struggling to get on the housing ladder. Everything from rent costs to grocery bills to energy to childcare to property prices, all of these things have gone up exponentially faster than wages, and many talented people are now choosing to leave. And now for the first time in decades, we're actually seeing a slowdown in population growth with a bean drain of young islanders of working age, who are couples and young families, who are leaving because of rising cost of living and the difficulties of renting and getting on the ladder. And it kind of feels like the social contract is broken down, because for a long time the message was, get a degree, work hard, you'll be rewarded. But when people who are even in stable jobs are stuck in the rent trap, that's frustrating. And the issue isn't just about homes, it's about Jersey's future and its future economy. If we're losing our brightest and best because they can't afford to live here, it's not just unfair, it's a threat to our economy and our society, because we're losing those skilled people who'd be obviously paying into the system, contributing to society. And all of this is contributing to a rapidly aging population and decline in birth rates, which is obviously going to put pressure on public services like healthcare and more people drawing pensions than paying in. And there seems to be a pivotal moment for policymakers like yourself to sort of step up and help address those issues. But so do you see that as a ticking economic time bomb for Jersey? And what does Jersey risk losing economically and socially if that trend continues?
Well, the way I've described it is that we're facing a terminal decline. Mm-hmm. And a community can't survive if it's made up of people who don't have hope that anything's ever going to get any better.
Yes.
You mentioned the social contract there, and I thought that was really important, because the whole point of life is to enjoy it and for things to get better as things go along. We try to leave something better for future generations, and that has been what successive generations have aimed to do. Mm-hmm. And many people, I would say particularly younger people at this point in time, it doesn't feel like many of them believe that Jersey can offer that place for them to be able to thrive, be happy, enjoy their lives and potentially have children, etc. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about whatever statistics we want, but we know this from speaking to people, that many people don't feel that their chances in Jersey are getting any better, and so are thinking of leaving.
Yes.
I've had lots of friends who have left the island, and the cost of living, and in particular housing, is a big part of that, because they know that they can go to other places that they'll be able to get a family-sized home with parking and a garden and have children there, whereas for the same cost in Jersey, they'd be looking at a one-bedroom flat. It's everything. If we don't resolve that, more people will leave. We won't be able to economically sustain supporting people in their older years in Jersey, because we need working-age people to be here and paying in.
Absolutely.
The only way that we could possibly get around that without fixing the root problem would be to rely more and more on seasonal workers who are only here for a few months before going, not establishing ties in the community. And, we need a mix of people in Jersey, but if people rooted in the community are becoming few and far between them, it would just be a worse place to live. And I think that's sad, because Jersey has so much potential. We're an affluent island. We're blessed by the fact we're not in a particularly dangerous part of the world. We don't have natural disasters or that kind of thing.
Sure.
So we really do have at our fingertips everything that we need to create a thriving society where everybody can have a decent quality of life. But for too long, our politics has not been delivering that for people, and that's why we've got to turn it round.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. I mean, I think in order for society to flourish, we need to feel optimistic about the future, to want to invest in it, to want to have children, to want to contribute to that society. And I think another dimension to it as well is that now increasingly a lot of people's work isn't location dependent as well. So if they wanted to base themselves elsewhere for a cheaper cost of living, then they can choose to do so. They need to feel like they're getting something back and they're being rewarded.
Yeah, if you feel that it's hopeless and things won't get better, you'll just check out at that point.
Yes.
But if you think at least there's a glimmer of hope, you're more likely to stick it out and maybe even try and be part of making things better. I hope at least that in the last couple of years, we will have started to give people that hope again, that we're now at least talking about these issues a lot more than we were a few years ago. And there are at least a few voices in decision-making positions that are treating them seriously and not just brushing them off and not giving them the due attention that they deserve.
Absolutely. And I think, this isn't a new problem in terms of properties being unaffordable for many islanders. I mean, house prices are up 444% since 1990, and wages just haven't kept pace. And even with the recent dip of 8% in house prices, which was the largest since 1986, borrowing costs are still high, and affordability is still a struggle. And you described that price drop as a moment of correction that could help first-time buyers and help young islanders have a better chance of getting on the ladder. But median earnings are still about £890 per week, and the average home price is 589,000 versus a UK average of 286,000. So, it's clearly going to be a struggle, for a lot of working people. Would you say that Jersey still is in a housing crisis? And what do we mean by that?
Yeah, it definitely is in a crisis. And I guess there are lots of different ways you could try to evidence that. But this goes back to what I said before. The main sign that we're in a crisis is that people feel like we're in a crisis and feel like their chances aren't as good as they feel they ought to be in an affluent society like ours. And that, I think, crosses across a lot of socioeconomic parts of our community.
Yes.
Where those on lower incomes are unlikely to feel like they can afford to buy a house. That's not the end of the world, because there are lots of societies where owning a home is not a big aspiration. And as long as renting is comfortable, lots of people around the world are perfectly happy with that. But for a long time, renting's not been comfortable in Jersey too. So we get the worst of both worlds there.
Yeah.
But I'm finding increasingly, I speak to more affluent people, including maybe slightly older homeowners who are doing themselves doing okay and don't have to worry financially and have that home that they're safe and secure in, but they're worried about their children not having the opportunities that they had, and that knocks their confidence as well and makes them worry that if their children leave, they won't get to be a part of their grandchildren's lives.
Absolutely.
Which is really important to lots of people.
And I think access to that family wealth is actually really important now. I mean, I've read a book called The Inheritocracy by Eliza Philby. And it's basically saying that the bank of mum and dad is now one of the top UK mortgage lenders now. And having access to that is kind of now one of the chief factors in economic success and kind of life outcomes. So that access to be able to sort of live at home and save up for your deposit, or for your parents to be, rent guarantors or even gift you a kind of a deposit, is actually a really big predictor of success, more so than a university degree or anything that you're kind of earning. And that kind of, I suppose, accidental kind of privilege has kind of widened economic divides, not just in Jersey, but also in the UK, especially for kind of, that millennial or kind of Gen Z generation. What measures do you think the government might be able to do to try and address that kind of inequality? Yeah,
so I think the example of the Bank of Mum and Dad is really useful for helping identify potential solution, because why does it have to be mum and dad who provide that, especially when lots of people won't be in family circumstances where that's possible, including if you're from a vaguely wealthy family. If you've got lots of siblings as well, that will make it harder for your parents to do that as well, do it equally and fairly. But why doesn't government play that role and play it on an equal basis for everyone? Last year, I launched a scheme called the First Step Scheme, which can provide equity loans of up to 40% of the value of a home for a buyer. And it in a sense, it's slightly playing that role like the Bank of Mum and Dad in that it's saying to people, okay, this is the kind of home you need. This is what you can afford. There's a gap. Can we step in and fill that gap? And if we provide that equity loan of that percentage that you can't afford, we can get you in there owning it. You then, from that basis and that home, can go on and thrive because you've got a home that's yours. You can invest in yourself. You've got that security that comes with that. If you develop your career, you earn more, you can pay that equity loan back. Or then if you want to move on, you pay the equity loan back at that point, and we use that to help the next person in the queue. So we did a bit of that last year and a little bit more this year. And I think that system's proven to be quite successful. It's managed to help families and single people as well become homeowners who otherwise would have found it impossible. So I'm now thinking, right, next year, do I go back and ask for some more funding for that scheme? Is there anything we can do to tweak it, to maybe target it more broadly? But that model's been proven to work. So perhaps that should be part of the equation in the future, that Jersey, as part of its promise to its population, has schemes like that, where if home ownership would be impossible for you without it, we can step in and make it possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, if that's the obstacle, just that little bit of help just to kind of get to that stage. And I suppose it begs the question, who should social housing be for? Who do we prioritise access for? Is it, is it couples? Is it families? Is it the elderly? Is it key workers, for example?
So this is one of those areas where it's probably understated how successful Jersey has been in the last 10 years, where our social housing a decade ago was terrible. A lot of it was in a very poor state of repair, was not maintained very well. Budgets were all over the place. But in the last 10 years, that has largely been turned around. The quality of the homes is a lot better than it was before. Andium Homes, as the government's main social housing provider, is the biggest housing developer on the island, and it's still going, even when other private sector developments are struggling a bit more. Andium is carrying on going and is still developing hundreds and hundreds of homes as we speak. And so does that present an opportunity to broaden what social housing is? There are places, particularly places in the UK, where people really turn their nose up to social housing and presume that it's basically the housing equivalent of an ambulance service. It's purely for people who are in desperate need, not a decent tenure of housing to enjoy and have security in. Contrast that with other places. Vienna is a really good example of a place where basically 100 years ago, they decided social housing is going to be the main tenure in this city, and it is. They're constantly developing it. It's something like 60% of the population lives in social rented housing, and their eligibility thresholds are high. So you get doctors living in social housing, you get generations of people living in the same area.
And there's not that sense of stigma or kind of
not even
class
vaguely. It's something they're very proud of, because they made a democratic choice 100 years ago that housing would be a human right, and it would be there would be at least a degree of public service ethos behind it, like the health service. We have a public health service because we accept that it's important that everyone in our society is healthy. And you can be a multimillionaire who turns up at A&E, you're not going to get charged more or treated differently to the poorest person on the island when they turn up at A&E. The only question is, can we make your health better and look after you?
Yes.
So the point I'm making there is that there's choices to be made. We don't have to have the system that we currently have.
Sure.
We could make different choices. And since Andium has been as successful as it has in the last 10 years in building more and better kinds of homes, is that now an opportunity to say, well, okay, let's open the doors a bit wider for people who thought, okay, I can get better affordability and security in that kind of home. Why not? If we've got space for them, why not?
So, because you mentioned some of the social housing that was kind of built in previous kind of decades, was a lot of that existing stock quite kind of tired and kind of needed upgrading? Or, just anecdotally, so my grandmother lived in social housing for many decades. And then a couple of years ago, I saw it listed on the private market for something like £250,000. And it was a tiny bedsit. You know, you couldn't swing a cat in that place, kind of thing. So, and obviously, there's I think Andium has 900 homes now under construction, kind of thing. So, I suppose my question is, you know, if we're selling off existing kind of social housing stock and we're kind of building new housing stock, where is the kind of net gain in that, and why is that happening?
Yeah, so I think that so we do sell off some of our social housing, but we have in recent years we've been doing it through a different kind of scheme than it used to be in previous years, and we've learnt some lessons from the past. And the UK introduced a right to buy for social housing in the 1980s, which at the time everybody thought, wow, this is brilliant. You're going to make homeowners out of social housing tenants. And
in the Thatcher era.
In the Thatcher era. And then, you know, within a generation, most of those homes are now owned by investors, and they've been, a lot of them converted into HMOs, rented out at extortionate rates. And there's a massive shortage of social housing. So Jersey, in recent years, we have shifted our scheme where when we sell social housing, it is sold through a very tightly controlled first-time buyers gateway. They're sold at discounts. So there's an equity share within that to make that more affordable. And there are limits on what you can do with it beyond then, including they cannot be sold to investors. So it's a good system because you use the homes that you're building through a public service, not just for social housing, but for first-time buyers as well. But we've locked in safeguards so that we can't suffer the worst of what happened in places like the UK that just totally undermined the system and destroyed it. So what Andium can do now, if they're modelling how they're going to financially plot developing somewhere, if they know, okay, we'll build this development, 30% of them we can sell to first-time buyers and 70% of them will be for social housing, they know when they're going to get a big chunk of the cash back in that they can then use to support the debt they've got for it. So there are ways that you can do it to support actually building more than you've lost partly through your first-time buyer scheme. And that's the mistake the UK made, that we've fixed that in Jersey.
Fantastic, yeah. And there was an independent report in 2019 that proposed a target of 7,000 new homes. And you describe that as sort of a work of fiction now because, you know, the island's changed, the world has changed. And now we're seeing, you know, a different kind of trend in kind of population kind of degrowth. So I suppose the question is, if we're seeing a population degrowth and we're building 900 new homes kind of thing, and, you know, I think there's a scheme for £100 million more funding in place, is there a shortage of social housing, or are we going to end up with a surplus of social housing, and how do we make sure that that's allocated to the right people?
So I've always said if we get a surplus of social housing, that's a problem I'd much prefer to have than a shortage of it.
That's a nice problem to have.
Absolutely, because you then have the opportunity to broaden what you do with those homes. You know, if we had a surplus, we could maybe trial new first-time buyer products that look a bit different to what we've currently got. So Andium, they don't really have a deposit saver kind of first-time buyer offer. They don't currently have a rent to buy first-time buyer offer. But if we had capacity, maybe we could start experimenting with that and see if there's demand for it and if people like it. And we could broaden the eligibility for social housing more broadly anyway. So you could
raising the income limits.
Raising income limits. We could be a bit less tight on bedroom requirement. So we could potentially house couples who haven't had their children yet but would like to and would prefer to settle before having children rather than wait until the children are born and then move into a home with the right number of bedrooms. There's things we could be looser on there that could be to benefit for people's lifestyle. So my view is that Andium should not slow down. It should keep going, and if we get to a point of surplus, great, that's a much better problem to have than a shortage.
And what would you say to critics that say that Andium has a lot of tax advantages and acquires land at kind of reduced rates while private sector developers might be struggling in the market? what would you say to critics who would say that Andium is kind of stifling the private sector and is becoming too dominant a player?
Yeah, I don't agree. I think if Andium weren't here, but bearing in mind that they are 100% owned by the public of Jersey, it's a publicly owned company that exists in its rules not to serve minority shareholders, it's to serve the public as a whole. And we have a degree of democratic control over it. So we could tell it to slow down if we wanted to. We could tell it to rein in particular things if we wanted to. So it's a good thing we've got that control over it.
And when you say we, do you mean the government, or do you mean?
Yeah, the government on behalf of the people. Right. So, if we had an election and a majority of candidates were elected who felt a particular way, you would hope that that would then mean that the public would get that outcome through that mechanism. But if Andium weren't ploughing ahead with the developments that they are, and we took a completely hands-off approach on that, is it a guarantee that the private sector would step in and cover all of that? It's not necessarily a guarantee that that would happen. There is lots of confidence in Andium because it's government-backed, so it will be giving private developers lots of work through its programs. And that is a good thing for the developers, knowing they've got a pipeline of work coming in. I think probably also bolsters their confidence to know, okay, in a couple of years, we can do this private sector scheme as well, because all of our workers will just move over to that scheme. So I think in terms of the macroeconomic picture, I think it's probably to the benefit of the island as a whole.
Should there ever be a limit to government intervention to not skew the market unfairly?
Yeah, that's a very philosophical question, and politicians of all different stripes will have different views on that. I mean, yes, there are limits, but it's a big democratic question as to how far they go. I do get told by some politicians that my view that we ought to broaden who is able to live in social housing is inherently wrong, because people shouldn't be housed through a housing provider that comes from government. It should be completely private. That's a legitimate democratic view, but it's the opposite one that I take. And different societies do have completely different models. So it's ultimately a choice. But I think, decent social housing that's broad and acts as a tenure of choice for people across different socioeconomic backgrounds is, I think, ultimately a good thing, and means we'll get more diverse communities, people living together, mixing together. Absolutely. And that's got to be good for our community, in my view anyway.
Okay, and I'd like to just move on to the government's role in the rental market as well, while you sip your designated driver mocktail. So many people think that the private rental sector operates on quite a punitive system, quite large upfront deposits, penalty for kind of breaking the agreement and kind of leaving early. And obviously high rents make it challenging to save to buy, so it kind of traps people and impoverishes them. And you've recently won an important victory in the Assembly, passing a significant tenancy law reform. Can you tell us what's changed, what resistance you faced and why that matters?
Oh, I faced a lot of resistance on this. It's taken me 5 years to get to the point where we now have a new residential tenancy law. The last residential tenancy law was from 2011, so we're 14 years later on that. Basically, the rules of renting, what kind of contracts you can and can't have, what terms are allowed and not allowed in those, it is an ongoing political question. Some societies have very loose rules on that. It's a complete free-for-all. It is down to landlord and tenant to negotiate, and that's that. Hands off, good luck to you.
Yes.
Other societies have stricter rules on that to say, no, we regard these terms as exploitative. They are not allowed to go in a contract. You can negotiate what you like aside from that, but not that. That's taken care of. Jersey's law was very thin. It didn't have a lot of protections in there or clauses that it dictated must be in rental contracts. It only really had a small number. So if you had a tenancy that didn't have a specified end date, a landlord was required to give you at least 3 months' notice if they wanted to end it. But that's it. No reason, no right of appeal, no nothing. That was really the only protection. I've always found that leaves the door open to exploitation, especially when there are all sorts of other concerns about what you need in your rental housing, that could make somebody question how much they stand up for themselves. If you know that you're always 3 months away from losing your home and there's nothing you can do about it, are you going to complain about that window that the landlord's not fixing, that's letting draft in or letting leaks come in?
Sure.
You might hold back on that, even though it is your right to have a home that is well maintained by its owner. And lots of other societies have different sets of rules on that. So basically what the new law has done, it's outlawed what I call revenge evictions, which is the possibility that for standing up for yourself, you can lose your home. So now if a landlord wants to end a tenancy, which they're obviously within their rights to do, the new regime will set notice periods based on the reason for doing so. So if you're wanting to sell the property, the notice is 3 months, or 6 months if you've lived in the home for over 5 years, to recognise the fact that it's a place you've been long established. But if the tenant is wrecking the place and causing a big problem, no, the notice period is only a week in that instance. So I think it strikes a balance in that sense that a good landlord with a bad tenant can take action, but a good tenant with a bad landlord gets protection. So that's a huge step forward from where we were. And I hope that it will mean over time, as tenants begin to realise that they can't get kicked out of their home for complaining about things that they're totally in the right to complain about, hopefully it will raise standards over time. And perhaps investors who hadn't been as focused on maintaining their properties in the past will start paying a bit more attention to it and just make it business as usual in future.
And do you think we've gone far enough, or do we need bigger and bolder interventions?
If I'd have had complete control over this and been able overnight to just implement whatever rules I wanted,
wave a magic wand,
I probably would have gone a little bit further on some things. I would probably have been a little bit tighter on the reasons for ending a tenancy. So one of the reasons, for example, is that if you want a family member to live in the home that you had previously been renting out, you can ask the current person living in there to move out. And I kind of don't really like that. I think if you're renting it out, it's that person's home, for the foreseeable after that. So I might have been a bit tighter on that. But I had to work with people who didn't necessarily agree with me on all of that. And in the name of progress, it's better to take on board other people's views and maybe moderate your position a little bit. And if I hadn't done that, I'd have probably lost the whole thing, in which case, what's the point?
You don't want perfect to get in the way of
Absolutely.
better. Yeah.
Indeed. And it's important that we do that in politics, because if your only position is everything's terrible, I've got the perfect solutions and I'm not listening to anyone else, well, they're not going to listen to you either, in which case you end up with nothing. So you've got to be prepared to work with people if you want to go in at least a positive direction.
Absolutely. And, you faced some quite fierce opposition to the Reform Act, and notably Sir Philip Balash, our former bailiff, proposed a wrecking amendment, and probably controversial question, but with so many states members being probably landlords themselves, is there a conflict of interest when it comes to reforming the rental market?
Yeah, that has been a really difficult issue for the last few years, because whenever anything has come up to do with renting properties out, including really basic things like minimum health and safety standards, every state's debate we have on it, we have to spend the first 5 minutes giving time for every member who's got a conflict of interest to have to stand up and put their hand up.
Right.
And it literally takes 5 minutes because so many in the Assembly have that interest. If you did that in most other places in Jersey society, you wouldn't have that. So landlords are very overrepresented in the States compared to tenants. Almost half of the population of Jersey are tenants. Out of our 49 states members, I think there's about 3 tenants in there, and I'm one of them. So tenants are underrepresented there.
Sure.
So it has made the political dialogue really difficult, and I think it's probably undermined confidence from renters in our society that they have politicians who understand them and see them and want their lives to improve. But that being said, through perseverance, engagement, and sitting down with people, we did manage to change minds And last week we got something over the line. And I do think that you shouldn't write someone off just because they tick a box. So just because someone is a landlord and theoretically has a financial interest in a political outcome doesn't mean that they're corrupt, that they're still capable of caring very deeply. And last week we demonstrated that because there were quite a few landlords who, when it came to it, did support the changes.
Right.
And I think that's because after a long debate and time listening, I think they just came to the conclusion it was the right thing to do. So hopefully that will have restored a bit of faith in our political process, seeing an unrepresentative States of Jersey making a decision that's probably representative of what people want.
No, that feels quite progressive, yeah. Just for the benefit of our audience who might not understand the way that the States Assembly works or operates, including myself. So when they declare a conflict, does that doesn't exclude them from voting? It's just making the Assembly aware that they have that conflict.
So it depends how unique that conflict is. So, for example, all States members are also taxpayers, so we couldn't not be allowed to vote on tax policy because there'd be no one left to vote if that happened. I remember there was a proposition a few years ago. It wasn't anything major. I think it was just appointing somebody to a particular body that they would have got a salary from doing, and it happened to be a politician's wife.
Oh, right.
That politician was not allowed to take part in that debate because their financial interest was very, very specific. It was about one person who they were married to, whereas the bailiff has ruled that being a landlord is a common enough interest. There are a few thousand people in Jersey who share that interest, so it's not unique enough to say that they are not allowed to vote. When I've been losing votes, that ruling's really annoyed me, and I wish that it had been the other way around. But last week when we won, I'm a little bit more relaxed about it now.
Fantastic. Congratulations on that. I just wanted to move on to inequality on the island, and there's kind of a widening gap between the richest and the poorest in our society. And at the one end, you've got kind of ultra high net worth mansions with infinity pools and 17 bathrooms, and the other we've got young families who are stuck renting forever, and that's quite a stark picture. And past governments have favoured building kind of luxury developments and flats which are inaccessible to many islanders. Are kind of luxury builds and ultra high net worth buyers making affordability and housing provision worse?
Well, I don't think they're making it better. I can't see a connection between that. And I also don't think that there's been much of a credible study on what impact that actually has in Jersey. Is one ultra high net worth coming here, buying up a mansion and then spending lots of money getting that property done up? But if you look at that in isolation, that sounds like a good thing. They're providing work, they're paying for it, great.
Yes.
But what if there are 3 families down the road with modest-sized homes who are desperately waiting for renovations to be done on it and can't find anyone to do the work because they're all working for high net worth? Like, there's never been a study as to what actually is the macroeconomic impact of it. That makes it difficult for me to have full confidence in that system. And I think at some point we need to stop just making presumptions about that system and actually ask for some evidence to be researched and come up with so we can work that out.
And you've openly challenged that before, haven't you?
It very much so. And I get a lot of pushback from it from people who say to me, basically suggest I'm thick for not realising the benefit that high net worths have when they come to Jersey. I try to respond to them to say, no, I understand that you get people come here who obviously make a huge contribution. They've got loads of money, expertise, and can do great things here, start businesses, donate to charities, great. But every time one of them does that, they're doing it on an individual basis. I want to know about across the board, because there might be some who aren't pulling their weight. And if they're not pulling their weight, is that a sign that the scheme ought to be tweaked so that it does focus on those who contribute more? And I'm often portrayed as a heretic for even asking the question, but I think it's a pretty reasonable question. I'd like some evidence before I believe something, please.
Really? It's a fair question, and it seems like we need to sort of strike a balance between attracting those wealthy residents and and fairness for locals as well. And what policy levers should we pull to kind of address inequality? Should we be clamping down tax-wise on kind of empty properties, for example, such as kind of second homes, imposing more regulations on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would support that, but I don't think it would be as groundbreaking as we might hope it would be. There are a lot of empty properties in Jersey that are sat not meeting their potential and not having families living in and being happy. A reasonable amount of those are not empty because somebody somewhere is just being lazy. A lot of them are empty because of really weird inheritance problems. So somebody's died without children or even cousins. So it's been inherited by 5 second or third cousins. Half of them don't live in Jersey. And, if you suddenly found that you'd inherited a share of a property and it was going to cost you more to get rid of it than you'd be able to make by keeping it, you'd probably put your fingers in your ears and pretend you didn't hear anything and hope it becomes someone else's problem. So I think that's probably been a bigger problem for the underutilisation of empty homes in Jersey. So rather than a tax, I think it would be better to implement something called an empty property management order system, which is basically the government or something connected to government having the right to identify a property that's been empty for years with no sign that anyone knows whose it is or what's going to be done with it. We'll take it over. We'll pay for it to be renovated. We'll get a family in there paying rent. And if the people who do own it show up one day in the future, we can say, great, here's the bill for the renovation we've paid for. If you want to pay for it, you can have it back, no problem. Or we'll give it back to you once the rent has paid off the renovation. I don't think anyone could complain too much about that kind of deal. And it would probably do a bit more to get those empty homes back into use than just putting a tax on it, which might make a little bit of money for some of them, but a lot of them would probably still end up empty and we wouldn't really know who to bill for that tax. So, yeah, there's solutions. We just got to, I think creatively about them.
So I wanted to move on to other regions in the world that try and kind of bold things and kind of getting this right. And you mentioned Vienna before as a really good example of, where social housing has been invested in. Canada has a $1.5 billion rental protection fund to let communities buy and preserve kind of affordable homes. Both Cornwall and Guernsey have restrictions on kind of like non-local buyers. Where in the world do you see solutions that Jersey could borrow from? Still good ideas.
Yeah, I think borrow from is the key phrase there because ultimately Jersey's unique and whatever overall package of solutions we have, it should be unique to Jersey.
Yes.
Just another place that we could look at is Singapore, where they have extremely high home ownership rates. And that is because of a conscious decision of their government 40 or 50 years ago that said it was going to basically provide a shared equity scheme for all of its citizens to help them buy homes. So again, they step in and provide the balance if you can't afford it all by yourself.
Right.
So you might only own 40% of the home, but at least you own 40% of it instead of 0% of it, and the government owns the other 60%. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
We've started doing a bit of that in Jersey already. Could we expand on it?
And there are some parallels, I think, between Singapore and Jersey in terms of being pro-business, low-tax kind of environment. Yeah.
Indeed, limited land on which to develop is definitely a big part of that as well. So that's really interesting. And I think also Jersey, I think many Jersey people do have that aspiration to own their own home rather than rent for their whole lives.
Yes.
Not everyone. Some people are perfectly happy renting for their whole lives. And in Europe, that's quite common for people to rent for their whole lives, and there's no problem with that. So I think that we can get the best of both worlds here with a decent rent system, which the new rent bill has taken us some other way towards that. More social housing and wider eligibility means people who don't want to buy their own home will have a really decent alternative with decent, thriving communities and inclusivity and all the rest. And for those who do want to own their own home, schemes that help them bridge the gap of affordability when they'd otherwise struggle. We can get a good balance of all of that into the mix. And then it'll be future generations' jobs to make sure that balance is kept and that we move with the times and make sure we are responsive to what people in Jersey tell us is what will keep them here and keep them living here, contributing, working, thriving, and not feeling like their best chances are somewhere else.
It's interesting. I want to just pick up on what you were saying about Vienna, because it seems like we'd need quite a large sort of cultural mindset shift here in Jersey, so that there wasn't that kind of social stigma attached to kind of social housing or kind of being in social housing. I wondered how we could kind of facilitate that. Is it a campaign that kind of wins hearts and minds? Is it about educating people that shows social housing isn't lesser or an inferior kind of product?
Yeah, well, if we want people to believe that it's not lesser or inferior, we've got to make sure that it isn't lesser or inferior in practice, that what is provided is as good quality as possible.
Yeah.
If you were maybe in my parents' generation, and you remember some of Jersey's social housing from decades ago, I can understand why they might have that cultural aversion to believing that.
Yes.
But at the same time, I know older people who lived in some of those communities decades ago, and they were the happiest times of their lives because of the close-knit communities they were parts of.
Sure.
I think if we're building good quality homes that are secure and affordable for people, and are mixed, including with first-time buyer homes in that, you'll get people mixing together more often. And I think people will then carry those memories. If you were a first-time buyer whose first home you got through an Andium scheme, when you're in your 50s and 60s and your kids are looking at getting somewhere to live and it's with Andium, they'll think, oh yeah, my first place was with Andium, they were really good to me. And that memory will carry through different generations.
Sure.
So it'll take a while to get there, but I saw it with my own eyes. Vienna, it took them 100 years to get to where they are now, but they now have social housing blocks of flats with rooftop swimming pools, and I've seen them with my own eyes. They exist, and that's just part of their offer. So why not one day?
21, 25, we could be having a very different conversation.
Absolutely.
If you could just sort of paint us a vision, and you've touched upon some of this already, but if we really cracked housing affordability, we cracked this problem, what kind of social and economic transformation could Jersey unlock?
If people aren't worried about their housing, they can spend their energy worrying about the other things instead.
Sure.
And if they're able to spend more energy on that, they're more likely to find the solutions. So if it's just a given that if you live in Jersey, your housing's going to be good, you don't need to worry about it.
Yes.
You can then think, right, can I afford to do some more training to gain some more qualifications and skills and work up? Can I afford to do all sorts of other things? Can I take some time off because I want to focus on looking after my children when they're first born instead of going back to work right away?
Sure.
You give people more choice to what they can do, and all sorts of benefits flow from that, whether it's children being nurtured more in their early years, or people upskilling and being ready for the jobs of the future, because that's going to be a big issue as well. I mean, that's a whole podcast in itself about AI and everything that's going to do to work here. But if you're not worried about your housing, you're more likely to find the solutions for that because you've got more time and energy for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just sort of a basic level of security that you need to feel optimistic and plan for the future. And then final question, if you had a magic wand, what's the one change that you'd make tomorrow?
Yeah. Okay, so it's slightly different tact for my answer here, but I would completely change Jersey's democratic system because we have really low voter engagement and really low participation in politics.
Yes.
But politics is the vehicle through which we deliver the solutions. And if people aren't engaged in that, then we're not going to find those solutions, or we might even go backwards because our politics isn't delivering. So if I had a magic wand, it would be to ramp up voter participation and engagement, because I trust the people of Jersey to find the solutions if they're all taking part. And as long as politics is of interest and participation of just a small part of our society, we cannot be surprised when it doesn't find the solutions that our whole community buys into. Yeah. So whether it's housing, healthcare, or anything, if we've got an engaged population, we're more likely to find the solutions there.
Thank you. Yeah, and why do you feel that there's such this dearth of voter engagement and kind of voter apathy in Jersey? Is it because Jersey politics is kind of quite opaque and kind of maybe a throwback to some French feudal system that people don't understand quite.
Absolutely. Our system is archaic. It's overly complicated. It's hard to engage with. The lack of entrenched party politics, I think, is quite problematic as well, because most of our politicians, if you put them in front of ordinary Jersey people, they wouldn't have a clue who they are or what they stand for. Whereas party platforms are a lot easier to get on board with and understand which one you like the most and want to get behind and support. So because the system is so opaque and undemocratic, it becomes harder to engage with it. And that's why a lot of people who have got other things going on in their life choose not to, and you can't blame them. So we need a better system, simpler, more accessible, and then I think more people will naturally start participating in it.
Absolutely. Well, Deputy Sam Mézec, thank you for being our first guest. It's been fantastic.
Thanks.